Okay, good morning.
Morning.
My name is Evan Weiner, and my background is radio and TV. In fact, somebody called me yesterday, said, "You want to do a podcast?" I said, "Call me at 3 o'clock this afternoon, because I don't have time to talk to you today, so we're going to talk about doing a podcast." How many of your relatives came through Ellis Island? Okay, a number of you. Ellis Island is not opened yet in 1891. It is being built in 1891. So Benjamin Harrison was president of the United States. And what was America like in 1891? And are there shades of 1891 that we are living through today? Well, Jim Crow, African Americans become second-class citizens. That takes root in the South in the United States. There's an immigration bill that is passed. Lynching becomes part of America, or is part of America. There is a lynching every other day in America. Jews are expelled from Moscow. Jews are thrown out of Moscow. They became somewhat successful. Get them out. We don't want the Jews here anymore. And some of the Jews ended up in Hamburg, and they came over to this country from Moscow. The U.S. Navy, there's an incident in Chile, and that is the first real evidence of the United States foreign policy in intervention somewhere else. There's something called the American Indian Boarding Schools, and there's something called the Canadian Boarding Schools, Canadian Indian Boarding Schools. Benjamin Harrison sets the table for Theodore Roosevelt to become a conservationist. He is the first conservationist president. The Forest Act, this is Wyoming. How many of you went to the movies in 1891 to see a movie? Well, you really couldn't. But Thomas Edison,
I wasn't here in 1891.
You weren't here in 1891. Well, your ancestors. However, there is a device set up that you can eventually see movies through a peephole right there. There was something called the Beer and Whiskey League, the American Association in baseball. And while you may think, well, it's about baseball, it's also about blue laws and drinking in America in the 1880s into the 1890s. Basketball, 2 words, basketball, invented. All you needed was a soccer ball and a pair of peach baskets, and you could play this game. And by the way, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Carnegie Hall, which was not known as Carnegie Hall in those days, it was known as the Music Box, opens up, and it's still there 134 years later, despite the best efforts of Robert Moses to knock it down. It's still there. Oh, and by the way, how do you spell Pittsburgh?
How do you what?
Pittsburgh, the city of Pittsburgh. P-I-T-T-S-B-U-R-G-H.
Yes.
But as of 1891, Pittsburgh lost its H. And it fought for 20 years to get that H back. And there is downtown Pittsburgh by the 3 rivers, the confluence of the 3 rivers. So what is Benjamin Harrison's America like? What was it like? Well, there was no electricity. You used gaslight. There was no radio. There was no TV. There was no internet. But you could listen to music if you wanted to on these big, big cylinders if you wanted to do that. You read a lot. Your kids played games. In fact, one of those games turned out to be one of the rules of basketball. Benjamin Harrison's America wrestled with issues such as economic policy. The economy was beginning to go south in the United States because of something called tariffs. Tariffs. There was an influx of immigrants, and there was deeply entrenched racism against various ethnic and racial groups. Congressman William McKinley of Ohio, his tariff of 1890 took full effect. This act significantly raised tariffs on imported goods to almost 50% on average, and I don't know if you caught it today, but India, the tariff on India is now 50% because they're buying Russian oil. I'll leave it at that. The tariff's main aim was to protect American industry and workers from foreign competition, but it jacked up prices as Americans were paying import duties, not companies. Americans were paying a tax on the goods coming, and it wasn't the companies paying it or other countries. There was an anti-immigration sentiment known as nativism, fueled by fears that immigrants would take jobs, threaten cultural dominance of Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and introduce radical ideologies. The Harrison presidency saw the systematic implementation of Jim Crow laws in the American South, mandating racial segregation in public facilities. Southern states enacted laws designed to prevent African Americans from voting. Campaign of violence and lynchings, primarily targeting African American men, but not exclusively African Americans, was taking place through the country and in particular the South. The legal system in the South was often stacked against black citizens, with former Confederate soldiers serving as police and judges. This is from a museum on Fifth Avenue during that in that museum mile opposite Central Park, and they did a display called "The Gilded Age in the United States." We're kind of going through that today in a little bit with the Gilded Age people today being Musk and Bezos and Zuckerberg. Back then it was Andrew Carnegie and Frick and also John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan. Those were the Gilded Age members. The Gilded Age in the United States, an era characterized by immense industrial growth, technological advances, and a widening gap between the rich and poor. You hear that today. There's a widening gap between the rich and poor. Period saw a boom in factory jobs, attracting both domestic workers from rural areas and immigrants from abroad. While industrialists amassed enormous amounts of wealth, laborers often faced stagnant wages, rising prices for basic necessities like food, housing, and health care. The wealthiest 1% of the population owned 51% of the wealth. 1%, they had more than half the wealth. And if you extend it out to the top 12%, they owned 86% of the wealth in the country. In contrast, the lower 44% of the United States, nearly half the country, owned only 1.2% of the wealth in the country. Now, there was something called the Henry Cabot Lodge Bill that was before the Senate back in 1890 and 1891. Now, Benjamin Harrison doesn't get full acclaim for being a civil rights activist as president, but he did try. And he supported this bill, which would have made it easier for African American men to vote in the South. At that time, only men were voting, except in Wyoming in the United States. Wyoming, which came into the United States in 1890, allowed women to vote. They were the only state that allowed women to vote. The Lodge Bill of 1890, or the Federal Elections Bill, was a proposed bill to ensure the security of elections for U.S. representatives. It was drafted and sponsored by Representative Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, sponsored in the Senate by George Frisbee Hoar of Massachusetts, and Harrison was solidly behind this along with Republicans. And here is Benjamin Harrison, and he wants this bill passed. The bill was created primarily to enforce the abilities of blacks, predominantly Republican at the time, to vote in the southern United States as provided for by the Constitution. The 15th Amendment already formally guaranteed that right, but white Southern Democrats had passed laws restricting voter registration and instituting electoral requirements such as the payment of a poll tax and take a literacy tax. and because most blacks were not educated and were poor, they couldn't do either one. So they were disqualified from voting. After passing the House of Representatives by just 6 votes, it went to the Senate for approval. Congress convened on December 1st, 1890. The President, in his message, argued at some length in favor of the Lodge Bill and urgently recommended its passage. On December 3rd, the Senate resumed consideration of the Lodge Bill. The bill was debated from time to time until the Christmas holidays came about. This is Senator Nelson Aldrich. He is from Rhode Island. And on January 20th, 1891, he moved to take up the resolution previously introduced by him, amending the rules of the Senate so to cut off the debate at the will of the remainder of that session. But the object of Aldrich and his associates who were in favor of the bill was to end the debate so a majority could pass the Lodge Bill at will. They gave themselves a deadline, March 4th, 1891, to pass the bill. Never happened. Never happened. And Harrison blamed this guy for it not happening. His name was Levi P. Morton. He was the Vice President of the United States, and he was the head of the United States Senate. The Lodge Bill was successfully filibustered by Democrats in the Senate with little action taken by the President of the Senate, who was the Vice President, Levi P. Morton, because silver Republicans in the West, and they wanted to dump silver into the economy. 16 pieces of silver or 16 ounces of silver equals 1 ounce of gold to create inflation. So the farmers would have more money to deal with to pay down their debt. And farmers were also facing a drought at that time. So they traded that away in support, for Southern support of the Sherman Silver Purchase Act, and Northern Republicans traded away for the Southern support of the McKinley Tariff. So that's dead on arrival. The Republican Party's commitment to African American rights had been declining for a long time, since Reconstruction ended in 1877. But even before that, there was a depression in 1873, and most people were more concerned about money and jobs than African American men's rights to vote. This 1890 Lodge Bill would be the last relic of Republican commitment to civil rights. Meanwhile, in Mississippi, on November 1st, 1890, the Mississippi legislature adopted a new constitution with a poll tax and a literacy test for voting. Sections designed to disenfranchise newly franchised African Americans and some poor whites. They said, we don't need you to vote either. You don't have the money to pay a poll tax? No big deal, you're not voting. You're not smart enough? No big deal, you're not voting. Politicians in Washington took notice. In Congress, there was not much appetite to allow black men to vote without obstacles, even though Harrison wanted that bill passed. If you get a quarter later on this year, chances are on the back of the quarter in 2025, a 2025 quarter, you're going to see a profile of this woman, Ida B. Wells. This is the last year that American women are going to be honored on the back of the coins. It was a 5-year deal. And Ida B. Wells is one of those on the back of the coin. So you know who Ida B. Wells is? Okay, you know who Rosa Parks is?
Yes.
Okay, they tried to desegregate busing in Montgomery in 1855, Montgomery, Alabama. Well, she was Rosa Parks long before Rosa Parks became famous for basically not giving up her seat on the bus in 1955, which led to the Montgomery boycott, bus boycott by African Americans. Ida B. Wells was fired from her job as a teacher in a segregated school in Memphis, Tennessee, for writing about issues of race and politics in the South for various publications. She was a vocal critic of the condition of segregated schools in Memphis, Tennessee. She was a civil rights leader in a time where very few people had taken on that challenge. Not only was she a woman, but she was an African-American woman. She had 2 strikes against her back in 1884. And this is what happened in 1884. While on a train ride from Memphis to Nashville, Tennessee in May of 1844, she buys a first-class ticket, but the train crew forced her to move to a car for African Americans. She refused on principle before being forcibly removed from the train. As she was being removed, she bit one of the crew members. She took a bite out of him. She sued the railroad, and she won $500, which would be about $16,400 today in a settlement in a circuit case court. The decision was overturned by the Tennessee Supreme Court. It would be the start of her activism, and she was an activist for a very long time after this, on behalf of colored people. Now, we have 2 men here. Okay, now, forget the men here. We're talking all about the women. If you were a woman in 1891, if you were living in 1891, which might have been your grandmother's, the American woman had fewer rights than a male inmate in an insane asylum. Women could not vote, could not serve on a jury, testify in court, hold public office, attend college, practice law. If a woman were married, it was illegal for her to sign a contract, own or inherit property, keep or invest her own earnings. In other words, if you had a job, you had to give it to the man, whether it's your husband, brother, father, uncle, whoever was the closest man to you. And automatic rights to her children. If you got a divorce, well, the man might get the children, not you. Women were expected to center their lives around family and home. Obey their husbands in all matters. How many of you would have obeyed your husband in all matters? Not many of you. Not voice a strong opinion in public. Behave in a refined, polite way. And what is a refined and polite way? What is it? But that was the role of women in America in the 19th century. The National American Women's Suffrage Association was trying to convince power people to let women vote. The president, Benjamin Harrison, didn't say a word as to whether he favored or disfavored women's right to vote. No country allowed women to vote, so there was a global push to get women the right to vote. The newly formed Social Democratic Women's Movement in Germany focused on economic freedom and equal pay. Imagine that, equal pay in 1891? Imagine that? By the way, the first equal pay law in the United States was signed by John Kennedy in 1963 and has never been enforced. But anyway, the German women became a large and radical socialist women's movement in Europe. The women's suffrage petition in Victoria, Australia, a petition signed by over 30,000 women advocating for the right to vote on equal terms with men, was tabled by the Victorian Parliament in September. Now, Wyoming was the first territory in 1869 and state 1890 to grant women the right to vote. Women in Kansas were able to vote in municipal elections in 1887. The Utah Territory granted women the right to vote in 1870, but this right was revoked by the U.S. Congress in 1887. Illinois granted women the right to vote for school officers in 1891. Well, there's an Immigration Act. The Immigration Act of 1891, it is the second Immigration Act in 9 years. The first one was in 1882. It was called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which threw basically Chinese laborers out of the United States, or most of them. These were the same people who built the railroads. Same thing happened in Canada, where Chinese laborers were thrown out of Canada. In fact, I had a friend, a guy by the name of the late Robert Lee, who never saw his mother after a certain period. She was sent back to China. His father stayed. They were in Nova Scotia, and prior to his death, he was suing the Canadian government for damages for taking his mother away from him. The United States wanted to stop immigration from China and from South and Eastern Europe, as those immigrants were deemed as undesirable for a number of reasons. The immigrants from Eastern Europe, Southern Europe were predominantly Italian Catholics and Jews. They wanted to keep them out. Chinese Exclusion Act, which was passed on May 2nd, 1882, was the first in a series of race and class-based legislation that resulted in exclusionary measures against Chinese immigrants. America was changing demographically, and there were some Americans, particularly up in New England and the Boston area, that did not want to see change. Benjamin Harrison's immigration vision. This was from a speech he gave at his inaugural speech on March 4th, 1889, and he begins the groundwork for immigration reform. Our naturalization laws should be amended so as to make inquiry into the character and good disposition of persons applying for citizenship more careful and searching. Our existing laws have been in their administration an unimpressive and often unintelligible form. We accept the man, not the woman, the man. Remember, women had no rights. Remember, women were useless in the United States, except maybe for cooking and raising kids. Anyway, we accept the man as a citizen without any knowledge of his fitness, and he assumes the duty of citizenship without knowing any knowledge as to what they are. The privileges of American citizenship are so great and its duties so grave that we may very well insist upon a good knowledge by him of our institutions. We should not cease to be hospitable to immigration, but we should cease to be careless as to the character of it. There are men of all races, even the best, whose coming is necessarily a burden upon our public revenues or a threat to social order. These should be identified and excluded. Now, what was the immigration policy? And when people tell you, well, my ancestors came in, well, yeah, they came in. They didn't need papers. They came in because of trade agreements between the United States and other countries. You were able to come back and forth, and if you wanted to become a citizen, you could become a citizen. But some states did not want you to become a citizen, so it was a hodgepodge around the country. The 1891 Immigration Act. It centralized immigration enforcement authority in the federal government, overriding state governments. They had the previous responsibilities to carry out federal immigration laws. The reason why Ellis Island was built because of corruption in New York City. Imagine that. Corrupt politicians in New York City, Tammany Hall, Bosch Tweed. We wouldn't have that. But they took it away from the locals to the federals, and that's why Ellis Island was eventually built and opened in 1892. The act also extended immigration inspections to land borders and created the Office of Superintendent of Immigration to supervise new immigration inspectors at points of entry within the Treasury Department, which was charged with overseeing immigration law in 1882. The 1891 Act also placed further regulations on contract labor and expanded the list of excludable and deportable immigrants to include, any of you a felon? Any of your ancestors felons? Well, these were the people who weren't allowed in. Polygamists. Utah finally got rid of polygamists in 1890. Any of you an idiot? Well, all idiots, all insane persons, paupers, persons likely to become a public charge, as well as those suffering from infectious diseases. And they made sure they tested your eyes in case something happened with your eyes. The office inspectors took on many duties formerly held by custom officials, such as gathering ships' passenger lists and determining and recording immigrants' admissibility. I was speaking on a cruise ship. I used to speak on cruise ships, Holland America. And there was a Holland America historian, company employee on the ship, talking about how cruise ships, they weren't called cruise ships in those days, they were steamer ships, were integral to immigration. And how they go through immigration on the ships, if you had a first class or second class ticket, you are okay, because they figured if you had enough money, you're not going to be a problem. The third class was called steerage. My family's probably steerage. They didn't have money. Your family was steerage? Yeah. And they checked you out if you were steerage, because they didn't know whether or not you were good or not. Now, here is the problem with immigrants. It's in New Orleans. This would lead to Columbus Day. Italian immigrants get lynched in New Orleans. It is called the Colossus Massacre. It is March 14th, and a mob of 10,000 or more angry men surrounded a New Orleans jail, shouting angry slurs at Italians, calling for blood. By the time they were done, 11 men would be dead. They were shot and mutilated in an act of brutal mob violence that took place in front of a cheering crowd. The 11 men were Italian Americans, and it begins with the murder of David Hennessy on October 15, 1890. He was the New Orleans police chief, and he was shot down by gunmen while walking home from work. As he lay dying, a witness asked him, "Who did it?" Well, he said, "Those so-and-sos," for Italians. New Orleans at the time was home to more Italian immigrants than any other southern state. And this is a drawing of what the jail looked like and what the mob looked like, and the mob is filled with guns. They're ready. They're ready. Those Italian immigrants were not welcomed by New Orleans residents. Though Italians had been living in New Orleans since the Louisiana Purchase, even before then, with the French there, their language and customs were considered foreign and even dangerous by some. There was a great deal of white Southerner animosity toward Italians who were immigrants and refused to abide by Jim Crow laws. The blacks were their friends. They weren't going to make them second-class citizens. David Hennessy's assassination and dying accusation fanned the flames of anti-Italian sentiment in New Orleans. Police rounded up hundreds of Italians, even those who didn't seem to be associated with the attack. Local papers fueled the fire, demanding justice and declaring 9 men who were arrested on the suspicion of connection to the murder guilty before they were even tried. Again, another picture of the immigrants surrounding the jail. When news spread that the trial had resulted in 6 not guilty convictions and 3 mistrials, the city went wild. Thousands of angry residents gathered near the jail. Impassioned speakers whipped the mob into a frenzy, painting Italian immigrants as criminals that needed to be driven out of the city. Finally, the mob broke into the city's arsenal, grabbing guns and ammunition. A smaller group of armed men stormed the prison, grabbing not only the men who had been acquitted or given a mistrial, but several who had not been tried or accused in the crimes. Shots rang out. 11 bodies ridiculed with bullets and torn apart by the crowd. Outside the jail, the larger mob cheered as mutilated bodies were displayed. Some corpses were hanged, while the remainder of the others were torn apart. Not only were they torn apart, people were grabbing pieces of the body and keeping them for souvenirs. Well, the news gets back to Italy, and things are not good in Italy. The lynch mob was composed of some of New Orleans' most prominent citizens, and those guys went unpunished. Some Americans, swept on the tide of anti-immigrant sentiment, applauded the killings. This is what the New York Times editorial page had about the killings. The New York Times. They called the victims desperate ruffians and murderers. These sneaking and cowardly Sicilians, the descendants of bandits and assassins, are, to us, a pest without mitigations. The New York Times. The New York Times, 1891. The real identity of Hennessy's murderer was never determined. Italy threatened to end diplomatic relations with the United States, and as a result, Benjamin Harrison decided a one-shot deal. We'll honor Christopher Columbus's 400th anniversary of arriving in North America, October 12, 1892, and that's it. And we'll send some money to Italy so they can give it to the victims' families. Columbus Day was not supposed to be an American holiday. Lynchings were widespread across the United States, particularly in the South, and affected both white and black individuals. While the New Orleans lynchings received international attention back in Italy, the majority of the lynchings targeted African Americans as a means of social control. The Tuskegee Institute recorded a total of 184 lynchings that year, one every other day, including 71 white victims and 113 black victims. Lynchings were a part of everyday America in 1891. The Jews are expelled from Moscow. Get out of here. We don't want you. We don't want your type here. Get out. Get out now. When the Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich became the Governor General of Moscow, he named one of his goals as being to save Moscow from the Jews. An imperial decree was announced on March 28th, ordering the expulsion from the city and government of Moscow of all Jewish artisans, brewers, and distillers. Jews had a long history of facing anti-Semitism in Russia, so this was absolutely nothing new. Persons who had been born in Moscow and who knew no other place of residence were obliged to go in search of a new home. Some 20,000 Jews were expelled from the city in short order. Any of you had relatives from Russia who came over, Jewish? I did. From Kiev. My grandfather's family, well, I'll get into that in a second. Poor Jews were sent to the Pale of Settlement, modern-day Belarus, Lithuania, Poland, Ukraine, Latvia, and Western Russia. I'm not sure where they came from, but they ended up in the Pale of Settlement. My grandfather was born in 1892 and came over, I don't know, with his brother and sister. So they were adults when they came over, presumably in the teens. He'd be 18 by 1910. Maybe earlier, I'm not sure. My aunt ended up living in Denmark for a while until the brothers brought her over. Anyway, so they were sent on criminal transports, and there were large rewards often to those who caught Jews hiding in the city. The newly built Choral Synagogue, opened the year prior, was ordered closed, in addition to 8 other synagogues of the 14 in the city. Some Jews ended up in Hamburg. They had enough money to get on one of those ships crossing the Atlantic to try to get into the United States. And guess what? Some of them did get into the United States. Meanwhile, there's an international incident involving this ship, the Baltimore. And that would be America's foray into foreign policy. The Baltimore crisis was a diplomatic incident that took place between Chile and the United States after the Chilean Civil War as a result of growing American influence in the Pacific Coast region of Latin America. It marked a dramatic shift in the United States-Chile relationship and would be the beginning of American interference in foreign policy throughout the world. It was triggered by the fatal stabbing of 2 United States Navy sailors from the USS Baltimore in front of the True Blue Saloon in Valparaiso on October 16. The United States Army became the most powerful Navy, the United States Navy rather, became the most powerful Navy in the Americas. The captain of the USS Baltimore allowed his men shore leave at Valparaiso. There was growing animosity between the Americans as the Harrison administration had openly backed the Chilean president, Jose Manuel Balmaceda, in his battle with the Chilean Congress. The rift turned into a civil war. Balmaceda resigned, fled, gained asylum in Argentina after the forces loyal to him suffered 2 defeats near Valparaiso in action. The U.S. minister to Chile gave political asylum to some of Balmacedo's supporters. The Baltimore incident. The new Chilean government initially rejected America's protests. It denied responsibility, and the foreign minister attacked Harrison's demand of $75,000, $26 billion today in reparations. He issued an ultimatum and hinted at war. European powers, they were friends of Chile, but they realized that America had the best Navy force in the world, and also there was a big American presence now in Latin America, and they don't intervene. Argentina and Peru had their own grievances. In January 1892, Chile capitulated to Washington's terms, apologized, and gave the United States $75,000 in gold. Well, the Indian situation in the United States had stabilized by this point. America stole all the land, all the Indian land. So what's the next step? Well, why don't we try to strip Indians of their heritage, of their culture, of their language? And not only in the United States, but also Canada. In March, Congress authorized the Commissioner of Indian Affairs to make and enforce by proper means such rules and regulations as will secure the attendance of Indian children of suitable age and health at schools established and maintained for their benefit. The primary objective of civilizing or assimilating Native American children and youth into the Anglo-American culture. In the process, these schools denigrated American Indian culture and made children give up their languages and religion. What Americans and Canadians were doing basically was this. They were kidnapping the kids and sending them to boarding schools. Federal government worked in tandem with religious organizations to send hundreds of Native American children to 2 off-reservation boarding schools, thousands of miles away from their families, operating inside a structure dedicated to the eradication of their identity. The boarding school system used children as pawns in the federal government's overall strategy to destroy Native American communities through the policy of assimilation. These schools prohibited children from speaking their tribal languages, required them to wear American-style dress and hairstyles, and made them give up their Native American religions for Christianity. In addition to standard academic tests, lessons in subjects like reading, writing, and mathematics, students learned trades that were marketable in American society, such as carpentry for boys, housekeeping for girls. Now, when I think back on all the crap I learned in high school, I would have been better off in home ec. I don't even know how to boil an egg. I would have been better off taking cooking. And some of the girls would have been better off in shop and learning car repair. 2 things I never learned either. These were the kids who were kidnapped, American Indian boarding schools. This was nothing new. As early as the mid-1600s, a smattering of missionaries worked to establish religious schools across New England, intentionally placing those institutions near indigenous communities in an effort to further spread Christianity and destabilize Native culture. There was the Wounded Knee Massacre, which came back in the 1970s. The congressional action that these Indian boarding schools came a little more than 2 months after the Battle of Wounded Knee. The Wounded Knee Massacre took place on December 20th, 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The United States military slaughtered approximately 150 to 300 Lakota Sioux people. The massacre was the climax of the U.S. Army's late 19th century efforts to repress the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. 2/3 of Lakota victims were women and children. 25 United States servicemen were killed, and they mostly fell because of friendly fire. Now, about 8 years ago, I was up near Sudbury, Ontario, and we went to Native Indian session where they did dances and also talked about the loss of their culture, because the same thing was going on up in Canada. In Canada, there was also a boarding school policy for First Nations or Native American people. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada have documented in 1891 residential school principles stating that teaching the gospel and promoting a better life compensated for the injustices of robbing and half-starving indigenous people. There was a belief that European culture and Christianity were superior and that indigenous people needed saving. And that was a persuasive idea at the time, and was used to justify the forced removal of children from their families and communities. The schools, often run by churches, subjected indigenous children to various forms of abuse, neglect, and cultural destruction. Meanwhile, speaking of destruction, Benjamin Harrison doesn't want destruction of forests anymore. That's gone. We're not going to destroy forests, and he decides to create national parks. Benjamin Harrison loved the outdoors. 3 times he visited Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, the first park created in 1872. On March 3rd, Congress passed the Forest Reserve Act, granting the president the power to establish forest reserves. Harrison set aside land in Wyoming to form one of the nation's first forest reserves. Shoshone National Forest was one of the first nationally protected land areas anywhere. Okay, so you want to go to the movies? This is your movie. It's a box, there's a viewer on top, and you look in like that. Oh, you're applauding Harrison, are you? You were applauding Harrison for his national forest. Teddy Roosevelt thought the world of it and expanded it. 1888, Thomas Edison announced he envisioned an instrument which does for the eye what a photograph does for the ear. He first used the term kinetoscope. However, his early attempts to record images on a photograph-style cylinder proved unsuccessful until an encounter with E.G. Marey in Paris in 1889 pointed the way towards sequential images recorded on a strip, moved intermediately in front of a single lens, a narrow strip with a single row of perforations. The team that Edison assigned to work on the project was headed by W.K.L. Dixon and included Charles A. Brown, William Hayes, and occasionally Frederick Ott and Eugene Lesti. Exactly when the kinetoscope first emerged and who played the most important part in developing it have been a matter of controversy, but it is ready by 1891. You look into this peep, and all those pictures go through here and stop there, and you're able to watch what's going inside. That Edison had set a goal and supported the research until its successful conclusion is not in dispute, even if it was his custom to claim a personal role in all inventions carried out in his organization for patent reasons. The kinetoscope, a peephole viewing machine which showed a film loop lit by electricity and activated by an electric motor, made its debut on May 20th. And he does it in front of a women's group. It is the meeting of the National Federation of Women's Clubs. The device was both a camera and a peephole viewer, and the film used was 18 millimeters wide. A patent for the kinetoscope, the camera, and the kinetoscope, the viewer, was filed on August 24th, 1891. Any baseball fans here? So. Okay, you don't have to be a baseball fan for this, because this is kind of microcosm of what is going on business-wise, what is going on in the minds of people, and what is going on in terms of religion in 1891. The end of the Beer and Whiskey League, the inaugural American Association season opened on May 2nd, 1892 with teams in 6 cities: Baltimore, Cincinnati, Louisville, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh with an H, and St. Louis. Events leading to the association's opening day can be traced to the National League's expulsion of its Cincinnati franchise after the 1890 season. Among the reasons for throwing out the Red Stockings were that the club permitted use of its grounds for semi-pro games on Sundays, the day of the Sabbath of the Lord. That was the blue laws, and that was all over the country at that point. And they charged less than 50 cents admission. It was cheap, $16 today, and they sold alcoholic beverages inside the ballpark. How about that? They're selling alcohol at the time where there was the women's temperance movement going on. During the winter of 1881, 1882, the Cincinnati Club joined the teams in 5 other cities to form the American Association. It was known as the Beer and Whiskey League, and that was not a term of endearment. It was a derisive term referring to the American Association. It was used by supporters of the National League in reference to that many of the biggest backers of the teams were breweries and distilleries, and it was meant to put the league down. And that is the Cincinnati team from that era. The American Association included teams in cities located or near the Ohio River. Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville. People didn't think highly of river towns. These cities were disparagingly referred to by people who were involved or rooted for the National League as river cities. Well, what was wrong with river cities? Well, the National League used this term to imply that these cities, and by extension the American Association, had lower morality or social standards. River towns sometimes were associated with rough characters, drinking, gambling, and the general lack of refinement. So they were low-class cities. They were low-class cities. You know, now you're tiering these cities. This is the highbrow city. That's the lowbrow city. And you could drink at the ballpark. The American Association scheduled Sunday baseball where it could be had and allowed the sale of alcoholic games. Anybody here from New Jersey? Okay. What do you remember about Paramus on Sundays?
Nothing.
Nothing. Okay, because nothing happened there also. Paramus to this day, the stores are closed in Paramus because of the blue laws. They are closed. And the residents do not want them open on Sunday because Route 17, Route 4, you can drive without traffic. Those places are packed during the week, Saturday particularly when people go shopping. But Sunday, you can zip right through there. So I could see why the businesses are closed, and why the residents want the businesses closed. Of course, the store owners don't want it because nearby at the Meadowlands you have a mall, and then you got another mall down in Wayne, which isn't very far from there, and then you got other malls in various directions. But Paramus still has that blue law. There aren't many places in this area that have blue laws, but Paramus does. In the 19th century, many areas of the United States had some form of blue laws restricting activities on Sunday, generally aimed at promoting Christian Sabbath observances. These laws, which originated in colonial America, traditionally prohibited various commercial activities and other forms of labor to encourage rest and religious observance. Well, again, this is also the time of Carrie Nation, and it's also the time of the Women's Temperance Union. And Carrie Nation is taking her hatchet, and she's going to various saloons, and she's breaking up the bottles in the saloons. Now, why was this happening? Because women felt that the men were drinking all night, they'd come home, and all they had to say was one thing, and the men would beat them up. So they felt that getting rid of alcohol at this time would actually help their mental and physical health. This attracted a larger working class fan base and contributed to the American Association's image as a more permissive and accessible league compared to the National League, which did not sell alcoholic games. National League owners seem to have the temperance movement in mind with the banning of alcoholic beverages at ballparks. The temperance movement was a social movement that began in the early 19th century, advocating for the reduction and outright prohibition of alcoholic consumption. So it's the end of the league, and oh, here's Pittsburgh. They got an H. They got the H on the shirt. Pittsburgh, it's right there, Pittsburgh. By 1891, the American Association owners had significant financial problems. In the mid and late 1880s, some of the teams left and joined the National League. Anybody here from Brooklyn? Remember the Dodgers? Yeah, well, their predecessor.
I walked to the Ebbets
You walked to
Field.
Ebbets Field, you sneak in? Because you can sneak in the right
No, I
field.
didn't sneak in, but I did walk.
Oh, you did walk, because the guy who was at the gate in right field by the line used to be drunk by the second inning, and a lot of people over the years have told me, we used to sneak in the right field. See, you could have snuck in. But what'd you pay, 15 cents?
Maybe.
Maybe. Anyway, so that Brooklyn team started out in the American Association. They won the championship, and then they joined the National League the year later and also won the league championship. 2 league championships in a row in 2 different leagues. The most significant blow to the AA, which is kind of an interesting set of initials, was dealt to by the Players League, third major league in 1890, which siphoned off talent and gate receipts. The American Association owners gave up and the league formally dissolved on December 18th at exactly 11:10 a.m. Not 11:09, not 11:11, 11:10. Officially merging with the National League. The new official name was the National League and the American Association of Baseball Clubs. 4 AA teams were added to the National League: the Baltimore Orioles, Louisville Cardinals, St. Louis Browns, and Washington Senators. The owners of the Boston Reds, the Columbus Solons, Milwaukee Brewers, and Philadelphia Athletics took buyouts and disbanded. How many of you have played basketball? Not, just recreationally. Okay, well, there's James Naismith, there's his soccer ball, there's his peach baskets. It was December 15th, 1891, actually December 21st, first day of winter, 1891, that James Naismith introduces the first game of basketball, 2 words. 13 rules created by Naismith. The game is tested by 18 students at the International Young Men's Christian Association Training School. 2 teams of 9 players, each compete against one another. The objective: throw a soccer ball into a peach basket attached to a balcony 10 feet above the floor. In 1890, Naismith, who was born in British North America, the colony of the province of Canada, moved on from his job in Montreal as the McGill University athletic director. McGill University is one of the best universities in North America, to become a physical education teacher at the YMCA International Training School. Bored and unruly students needed an activity during the difficult New England winters. Springfield, Massachusetts, they get snow and ice and cold. Luther Gulick, he's the head of the physical education department at the International YMCA Training School, Springfield, Massachusetts, persuaded Naismith to create an indoor game that could be played during the winter between football and baseball seasons. And this is Gulick. He stressed the need for a new indoor game that would be interesting, easy to learn, easy to play in the winter by artificial light. I guess they might have had some lights because there were lights in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, about an hour, 45 minutes away. They had street lights already in Pittsfield. No one in class had followed up on Gulick's challenge to invent such a game, but now, faced with the end of fall sports season and students dreading the mandatory and dull required gymnasium work, Gulick had a meeting, and at the end of the faculty meeting told Naismith, "Hey Naismith, I want you to take that class and see what you can do with it." His challenge: create a game that was easy to assimilate, yet complex enough to be interesting. Had to be played indoors, on any ground of land, and by a large number of players at once. It should provide plenty of exercise, without the roughness of football, soccer, or rugby. Anybody ever play a game called Duck on a Rock? Anybody ever hear of the game Duck on a Rock? Other than doing research on Naismith, nor have I. Apparently, Duck on the Rock was a game he played as a kid who would lead to basketball. He took elements out of other games: American rugby, there was passing, English rugby, the jump ball, from lacrosse, the use of a goal, from soccer, the shape and size of the ball, from duck on a rock, a game Naismith had played with his childhood friends in Benny's Corner, Ontario, a ball and a goal that could not be rushed. The goal could not be slammed through, thus necessitating a goal with a horizontal opening high enough that the ball would have to be tossed into it rather than being thrown in. And that's how basketball started. Peach basket and a soccer ball. Naismith approached the school's janitor hoping he could find two 18-square-inch boxes as goals. The janitor came back with two peach baskets instead. Naismith nailed them to the lower rail of the gymnasium balcony at each end. The height of the lower balcony happened to be 10 feet. A man was stationed at each end of the balcony so he could pick up the ball while it was in the basket, throw it back into play, but they had a jump ball. And that was that. Oh, how many of you have dropped a handkerchief to attract a man? Didn't you remember movies where the woman would drop the handkerchief and the man would come by and says, "Is this yours, madam?" Apparently that was a big deal in the 1890s. Drop the handkerchief, not for Naismith's boys. The invention of basketball was not an accident, Naismith said. It was developed to meet a need. Those boys simply would not play drop the handkerchief. The game was boring. So this is what drop the handkerchief was. It was a Victorian-era social custom where a woman would intentionally drop her handkerchief in front of a man she was interested in as a subtle invitation for him to approach and initiate a conversation or a courtship, given the social constraints of women initiating contact. So it was a way of a woman picking up a man. Now my wife was much more simpler than that. We were out of somewhere and she came around, looked me in the face and said, "What's a guy like you doing in a place like that?" That's how she picked me up. It's a great pickup line. It's a great pickup line. So none of you ever considered drop the handkerchief. So a man always courted you. Not me. Not me. She looked right in my face and I said, "I'm just here." And that was the end of that. Called the boys to the gym. Divided them up into teams of 9, gave them a little soccer ball. Naismith recalled in a 1939 interview on WOR, Radio 710 in New York. I showed them the 2 peach baskets I nailed to each end of the gym and told them the idea was to throw the ball into the opposing team's peach basket. I blew the whistle and the first game of basketball began. Carnegie Hall. How do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. It was called the Music Hall, and it opened on May 5th. It was a landmark event in New York's cultural life. Andrew Carnegie, the steel mill baron and philanthropist, put up the money to make the construction possible. The building construction cost $1.1 million, $39 million today. The opening concert, well, who was conducting? Tchaikovsky. The building was designed by the architect William Brunette Tuthill, who paid particular attention to the acoustics. Acoustically, it's perfect. And we're going to leave in Pittsburgh. How many of you have been in Pittsburgh? You've been in Pittsburgh. Okay, so you spell Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh. That's how you spell it. Except the United States, they were streamlining names of cities and decided, you know what? Pittsburgh, water fountain in the Golden Triangle, didn't need an H. Didn't need an H. As other cities didn't need an H. The United States Board on Geographical Names adopted 13 general principles to be used in standardizing place names. One in which was place names ending in B-U-R-G-H. You have to drop the H. You're going to drop the H. At this time, the city's name was rendered Pittsburgh. The board supported its decision to rename Pittsburgh by referencing printed copies of the 1816 city charter, which featured the spelling Pittsburgh without the H. Locals began the fight to get back the H. That is Benjamin Harrison, and let's look back at 1891, how it impacted things today. The McKinley tariffs, which Benjamin Harrison supported, led to an economic downturn, which in part caused the panic or depression of 1893. Workers would start going on strike, and there would be violent responses to workers' actions starting in 1892. Jim Crow South, colored entrance. This is a museum in Mobile, Alabama. Harrison blamed Levi P. Morton, his vice president, for his failure to get the Lodge Bill passed through Congress. Harrison would dump Morton as his running mate in 1892 during the presidential election. A unanimous Supreme Court vote on April 25, 1898 upheld Mississippi's claim that their constitution was not discriminatory. State constitutions with similar voting suppression statutes were adopted by South Carolina, 1895, Louisiana, 1898, North Carolina, 1900, Alabama, 1901, Virginia, 1901, Georgia, 1908, and Oklahoma, 1910. The poll tax was eliminated by a constitutional amendment in 1964. This is Ida B. Wells. And like I said, look at your quarter sometimes. If it's 2025 quarter, look at the back, because you're going to see her on the back. In 1896, Wells formed several civil rights organizations, including the National Association of Colored Women. After brutal attacks on the African American community in Springfield, Illinois, in 1908, Wells took action. In 1909, she attended a conference for an organization that would later become the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. She was one of the founders. 89 years after her death, in 2020, Wells was awarded a Pulitzer Prize for outstanding and courageous reporting on the horrific and vicious violence against African Americans during an era of lynching. 2025, and this is 94 years after her death, she was honored on the back of a quarter. Women did get the right to vote, eventually. Women in New Zealand gained the right to vote on September 19, 1893, when the electoral bill was signed into law by Governor Lord Glasgow. This made New Zealand the first self-governing country in the world to grant women national voting rights. Most, but not all, American women got the right to vote in 1920. Native American couldn't vote until 1924. Do you know why Native Americans couldn't vote? They were not citizens of the country, and they were here before the settlers were here. They got the right to vote that year when they became citizens. William Howard Taft in this cartoon, keep the immigrants out. In the early 1900s, U.S. immigration officials mistakenly thought that the peak wave of immigration had passed. But in 1907, more than 1 million immigrants were processed. 1924, the Johnson-Reed Act severely limited immigration, virtually shutting America's doors to Eastern and Southern Europeans. Chinese Exclusion Act was repealed in 1943. Columbus Day. This is how Columbus Day came about. The New Orleans lynching fueled anti-Italian sentiment and strained diplomatic relations between the United States and Italy. The Italian government demanded justice and reparations for the victims' families, and Italy recalled its ambassador in protest. To ease tensions, the president, Benjamin Harrison, declared the first national celebration of Columbus Day in 1892. He also paid $25,000, about $883,000 today, in reparation to victims' families. Columbus is now viewed as a symbol of colonization, violence, and transatlantic slave trade. That is Jews in Moscow. The Jewish expulsion from Moscow reached its climax during the winter days of 1882, when police made a concentrated effort to search out the Jews and drive them out of the city. Generous rewards were offered for the seizure of any still in hiding. About 30,000 Jews were expelled, 5,000 remained. 1899, authorities ordered that no more Jewish merchants were to be registered in the first guild unless authorized. by the Minister of Finance. Jews were fleeing Europe and heading to the United States. Benjamin Harrison in the Navy. 1888, U.S. Navy did not have any battleships. President Benjamin Harrison recognized the need for a modern, powerful Navy to support America's growing commercial and international ambitions. His administration initiated a significant shipbuilding program. Thinking was, without a strong naval fleet, the United States would be easy prey for pirates. There was also a growing concern about defending the coastlines and shipping routes, threats of Chilean hostilities and European intervention. Harrison would expand Americans' influence globally. Here was about Native Americans. February 1973, activists with the American Indian Movement seized and occupied Wounded Knee, South Dakota, for 71 days to protest the U.S. government's mistreatment of Native Americans. The standoff resulted in the deaths of 2 Native Americans. The rise of pan-Indian activists, tribal nations' continuing complaints about schools and studies led to the passage of the Indian Self-Determination Education Act of 1975, enabled the tribes to establish reservation community schools. President Joe Biden designated the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania as a national monument in December 2024. Pope Francis, April 1st, 2022, during a meeting of a delegation of First Nation representatives and the Pope at the Vatican, he apologized for the conduct of some members of the Roman Catholic Church in the Canadian Indian residential school system during a July 2022 pilgrimage to Western Canada. Pope Francis reiterated the apologies of the Catholic Church with hundreds of Indigenous people and government officials in attendance for its members' role in administrating many of the residential schools on behalf of the government and for abuse that occurred at the hand of Catholic priests at the religious schools. That is Glacier National Park. Benjamin Harrison used the Forest Reserve Act 17 times, setting aside land in Colorado, including Pikes Peak, Oregon, California, Washington, New Mexico Territory, Alaska Territory, and the Arizona Territory. In 1907, the forest reserves were renamed National Forests, and he would lay the groundwork for President Theodore Roosevelt's conservation policy between 1901 and 1909. Going to the movies, about 1894, you got to see this movie. It's called Fred Ott Sneeze. It's a 4-second movie. But it becomes the first motion picture registered for copyright in the United States and one of the earliest movies ever in the United States. Sandy Koufax and the Brooklyn Dodgers over there. There are 4 American Association franchises that join the National League that exists today. The Pittsburgh Pirates, Cincinnati Reds, Los Angeles Dodgers, St. Louis Cardinals. The National League was a monopoly. The league was not successful. 4 teams would lead by the end of 1899. Baltimore, Cleveland, Louisville, and Washington. The National League would not expand until 1960, when the owners took in the New York Mets and the Houston Colt 45s franchises. Basketball, it's a book I wrote on basketball. Peach Baskets, Dance Halls, and the not-so-stern NBA. Took decades for basketball to catch on as a spectator sport, and would be the college game that would do it. Many professional leagues failed. Harlem Globetrotters would be popular in the 1940s and 50s. The NBA today is worth billions of dollars, and it's an international entity. And we leave with Pittsburgh. And we leave with Carnegie Hall. Well, Andrew Carnegie was from Pittsburgh. In October 1955, the New York planner Robert Moses let it be known that an acre in Lincoln Square, Manhattan project that he was planning would be set aside for a site to build a new concert hall for the New York Philharmonic. If the Philharmonic moved to its new home at the proposed Performing Arts Complex, Carnegie Hall would lose more than 115 days of rent annually and would cripple it financially. A campaign to save the concert hall was started. People like Isaac Stern and Jack Benny were involved. In 1960, Carnegie Hall was saved from the wrecking ball. Lincoln Center was built. Carnegie Hall was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1964 and a New York City landmark in 1967. Yes?
Can you do this, do it, come back when you come back?
Yeah.
Because everybody.
Yeah. Well, we're done.
They go
This
for
is
lunch.
done.
Oh, okay.
This is done. This is Pittsburgh. We are done. The Pittsburgh Gazette refused to adapt the H. The United States Board of Geographic Names decided to drop the H, as did the Pittsburgh Stock Exchange and the University of Pittsburgh. Well, they fought for 20 years. They fought and they fought and they fought, and they won. Official city documents continued to use the old spelling. Responding to mounting pressure, the board reversed its decision on July 19, 1911, and the Pittsburgh spelling was restored 20 years after it lost the H. Questions or comments?
Why did they have to change it?
Because some government official said, let's drop the H.